How did France and Spain take advantage of the Union being distracted during the Civil War? What mischief did they cause in Mexico and Santo Domingo, which is today's Dominican Republic? Did Santo Domingo seek to be annexed by the United States because of conflicts with Haiti, its neighbor on the island of Hispaniola? Why didn't the European powers support the Confederacy during the Civil War? What was General Grant's opinion of General Meade, who won the Battle of Gettysburg? And what role did the Union Army play in the post-Civil War military conflict in Mexico? Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources used for this video. Please feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare, which includes illustrations. Our sister blog includes footnotes, and both include our Amazon book links. In his memoirs, Ulysses S. Grant answers the question, what was the primary cause of the Civil War? Grant assures us the cause of the Great War of the Rebellion against the United States will have to be attributed to slavery. For some years before the war began, it was a trite saying among some politicians, including Lincoln in his House Divided speech, that a state half slave and half free cannot exist. All must become slave or all free, or the state will go down. Slavery was an institution that required unusual guarantees for its security wherever it existed. Grant then criticizes a fugitive slave law enforced before the Civil War that compelled Northerners to help apprehend and return runaway slaves. And why did Grant call this phrase in Lincoln's famous speech a trite saying? Perhaps we should not read too much into this, as Grant was furiously writing his memoirs so his widow would not live her remaining years in poverty, and he was near death when he finished his memoirs in 1885. Reconstruction had ended some years before. Was perhaps Grant unwilling to risk antagonizing his Southern readers? The Civil War was fought over slavery, as the public declarations of the Southern State Secession Conventions confirmed, as did the pre-war cornerstone speech of the future Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens. Grant also points out that in the early days of the country, before we had railroads and telegraphs and steamboats, the states were almost each a separate nationality. But by the time of the Civil War, the country was too interconnected, and the disputes concerning slavery in the territories too bitter to long maintain peace. Grant commented that it is probably well that we had the war when we did, and the monarchies of Europe were warily watching our Republican experiment. And Grant appears to argue that the technological and social effects of the war would strengthen the country. We do know that after the war, without the agrarian South blocking progress, the United States embarked on industrial expansion and settlement of the Western territories with the passage of the Homestead Act. Did Grant view the Civil War as inevitable? Many Northerners thought so, though they hoped it would never ignite. When Professor Gallagher of the Great Courses Plus was featured in an online discussion, I asked him whether Northerners feared that if the Confederacy were permitted its independence, that armed conflict would be inevitable over the question of whether the Western territories would join the Union or the Confederacy. And he would know this since he likely read many of the newspaper accounts of the day, and he confirmed that this was true. But I've never seen this stated as a reason for the inevitability of the Civil War. So if there's any graduate students out there listening, this would be a great question to research. And what was General Grant's opinion of General Meade? And Grant included complimentary short profiles of the Union generals in the war, and the most interesting is his evaluation of General Meade's abilities. Although General Grant was winning victories in the Western theater of war, in the Eastern theater, mostly fought in and near Virginia, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee had impressive victories. Abraham Lincoln eagerly accepted General Hook's resignation 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg, ordering General Meade to take charge since Lee's armies were already in Pennsylvania. Now, Meade was a competent general with a good feel for the terrain, so he put up a competent defense against Robert E. Lee, although the Union victory was also due to luck and great effort by some key Union forces, as is often the case in war. Abraham Lincoln, however, was livid that Meade did not aggressively pursue Lee's army and destroy it, permitting it to escape back into Virginia, a complaint he expressed often against General McClellan early in the war. But Meade's army had eaten little in the 3 days of fighting at Gettysburg. They needed to recover. 6 months after Gettysburg, Lincoln placed General Grant in charge of all Union armies. Grant did not demote Meade, but merely attached himself to his armies, making Meade effectively second in command. We can deduce Grant's reasons for keeping Meade at his current rank and post from his memoirs. General Meade was an officer of great merit, with drawbacks to his usefulness that were beyond his control. He had been an officer of the Engineer Corps before the war, and consequently had never served with troops until he was over 46 years of age. Meade never had, I believe, a command of less than a brigade. He saw clearly the position of the enemy and the topography in front of his position. He was subordinate to his superiors. He was brave and conscientious and commanded the respect of all who knew him. But his one fault is that he did have a temper. Another question raised by historians is why General Meade did not attend the surrender ceremony at Appomattox. Some say it was a slight by Grant. Now, I'm not a Civil War specialist, but I can find no definitive account confirming this slight. It appears that General Meade was simply too far away to make the meeting. The surrender could not be delayed out of courtesy to Meade. And what was the history of the Union and Confederate Civil War diplomacy? Throughout history, civil wars and armed conflicts are often influenced by outside intervention. For example, France helped win the American Revolution a century before. And in the ancient world, Persian funding helped Sparta win the Peloponnesian Wars. And in modern times, the superpowers influenced the course of the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The illustration depicts the Trent Affair, a diplomatic crisis caused by a Union captain who captured 2 Confederate envoys from a British steamer. Though this was a popular act in the United States, it risked war with Great Britain, a risk Lincoln did not want to take. The North released the Confederate envoys and stated that it did not approve of the captain's actions. Why did the European powers refrain from intervening in the Civil War? Ulysses Grant makes this prescient observation. Seeing a nation that extended from ocean to ocean, embracing the better part of a continent, growing in population, wealth, and intelligence, the European nations thought it would be well to give us a check. And the Union Army and Navy were powerful. The American Civil War was fought only 50 years before the First World War, where American forces tipped the balance, enabling the Allies to defeat Germany. And this confirms that during the Civil War, the European nations were already becoming wary of the growing might of the United States. And what was the diplomatic situation during the Civil War? During this time, the Union had capable diplomats, while the Confederacy had few European contacts. Southern planters knew that the English cotton mills were dependent on Southern cotton and were convinced they could blackmail England into supporting the Confederacy by refusing to sell cotton to England in 1861, which was a severe miscalculation, much to the economic detriment of the South. And several factors reduced the leverage of King Cotton. England was more dependent on northern corn shipments than on southern cotton. Due to recent bumper crops, England's stockpiles of cotton would last through 1862. Ultimately, the cotton embargo was ineffective, depriving the Confederacy of desperately needed trade and revenue, while England found alternate sources of a lower grade of cotton from Egypt and India. Southern cotton was not king, after all. Now, at the beginning of the Civil War, the Union was publicly fighting the war to save the Union. It had no clear policy against slavery, especially since slavery was permitted in the 5 northern border states. In July 1862, the English Parliament debated whether the Confederacy should be recognized. Confederate victories in 7 days' battles and the Second Manassas convinced some British that the Confederacy could win the war. But the Union victory at Antietam in September 1862 dissuaded the British and the French Emperor Napoleon III from recognizing the Confederacy. And the dual defeats of Gettysburg and Vicksburg silenced all talk about recognition. But even if France or England had recognized the Confederacy, that would have only been the first step in coaxing one of them to support it. England was considering recognizing the Confederacy because the Prime Minister of England, Lord Palmerston, had been an enemy of the United States all his life, reasoning that a weakening of America would be in British interests. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, when Lincoln promised to free the slaves in the rebelling states, that meant that European public opinion would strongly support the Union cause. Britain had made the slave trade illegal since 1807, enforced by British warships. Plus, no nation wanted to call Lincoln's bluff. He had threatened that the United States would declare war against any European power that recognized the Confederacy. Both France and England gave the Confederacy belligerent status, which simply meant that they could sell supplies and war materials to both sides. The Confederates successfully purchased war supplies and warships from England early in the war, but the Union successfully blocked these purchases from England later in the war. England chose to honor the Union blockade because it did not want to set precedent that would harm its efforts in future conflicts. And how did some of the European powers take advantage of the Civil War? Well, France and Spain both took advantage of the Civil War. The Monroe Doctrine is the United States foreign policy that opposes European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. It was announced by President Monroe in his 7th State of the Union address to Congress in 1823, about 40 years before the Civil War. Most of the Spanish colonies had declared their independence, and he did not want European powers meddling in the affairs of these newly sovereign states. In exchange, Monroe promised America would not interfere in European affairs, and would not disturb any existing colonies. And at that time, the United States was unable to enforce this doctrine as she did not have a strong navy. But this doctrine was tacitly approved by the British. But as the United States Navy grew in strength during the Civil War, the Union flexed its diplomatic muscles more effectively. By the end of the war, the Union had the second largest navy in the world, next to the Royal British Navy. However, with the United States distracted by the massive military demands of the Civil War, Emperor Napoleon III was tempted to meddle in Mexico. He sent 35,000 troops to Mexico and overthrew the government of Benito Juarez in 1863, installing the Austrian Archduke Francis Ferdinand as Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, supported by pro-Catholic Mexican conservatives. In his Memoirs, Grant stated that when England and France installed Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico, they disregarded the independence of Mexico and threatened the peace of the Americas. Grant recalls, after the surrender of Robert E. Lee, I sent Sheridan with a corps to the Rio Grande to have him where he might aid Juarez in expelling the French from Mexico. This soon led to a request from France that we should withdraw our troops from the Rio Grande and to start negotiations for the withdrawal of theirs. And finally, France ordered their troops to withdraw. From that day on, the empire began to totter. Mexico was then able to maintain her independence without aid from us. Grant's decision to send Sheridan's forces to Mexico helped the liberal opposition to Emperor Maximilian. Grant encouraged President Johnson to send military aid to the liberal opposition. Grant continues, France is the traditional ally and friend of the United States. I did not blame France for her part in the scheme to erect a monarchy upon the ruins of the Mexican Republic. This was the scheme of one man, an imitator without genius or merit. He had succeeded in stealing the government of his country against the wishes and instincts of his people. He tried to play the part of the first Napoleon without the ability to sustain the role. Grant concludes, like our own war between the states, the Franco-Prussian War was an expensive one, but it was worth to France all it cost her people. It was the completion of the downfall of Napoleon III. The beginning was when he landed troops on this continent, and he's referring to the war provoked by Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor of Germany, where he dealt France a humiliating defeat in the 1870s, capturing Napoleon III. Grant continues, I never admired the character of the first Napoleon, but I recognize his great genius. His work, too, has left its impress for good on the face of Europe. The third Napoleon could have no claim to having done a good or just act, and Napoleon III was a descendant of the Emperor Napoleon. Afterwards, Secretary of State William Seward proclaimed in 1868 that the Monroe Doctrine, which 8 years ago was merely a theory, is now an irreversible fact. Emperor Maximilian foolishly chose to stay in Mexico when the French troops departed. He was a tragic figure. He believed in liberal causes such as freedom of religion and supported the sale of church property in Mexico, which eroded his support among the conservatives. But this did not sway his liberal opponents, and his offer to appoint the leader of the opposition as prime minister was rejected. After the liberals prevailed in the military struggle, they executed Maximilian. Now later as president, Grant was obsessed with annexing Santo Domingo, but badly bungled selling this idea to Congress and the American voters. Remarkably, he devoted a paragraph in his Memoirs to this obsession. And this paragraph is one of the few controversies from his later presidency that he discusses in his Memoirs. Grant explains to his readers that Santo Domingo, which is today's Dominican Republic, was offered freely to us, not only by the administration, but by all the people, almost without price. The island is upon our shores, is very fertile, and is capable of supporting 15 millions of people. I took it that the colored people would go there in great numbers so as to have independent states governed by their own race. They would still be in the states of the Union and under the protection of the general government, but the citizens would be almost wholly colored. Now, when the United States was distracted by the Civil War, Spain sought to meddle in Santo Domingo. In 1861, the Dominican army leader Pedro Santana convinced Spain to annex the Dominican Republic as a Spanish colony. After the end of the Civil War, Spain decided to withdraw its forces when the United States threatened to assert its claimed rights under the Monroe Doctrine. Now, many Americans had their eyes on Santo Domingo, viewing it as a possible haven for freed slaves fleeing from Southern injustice. Many racists supported sending freed slaves overseas, and some abolitionists and black leaders favored this colonization movement. Lincoln's enthusiasm for establishing foreign colonies for freed slaves had cooled by the time he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. America was the only home that nearly all the freed slaves had known, and some who later had immigrated to Africa moved back to America. And one example is W.E.B. Du Bois's associate, Alexander Crummell, the black Episcopal priest who initially emigrated to Liberia, but returned to America to escape political instability. Had Grant been successful in annexing Santo Domingo, this likely would have been another one of the many financial scandals that discredited his administration, as the promoters had dubious, selfish motives. Colonel Joseph Fabens, a New England expatriate and speculator, gave a glowing report on the rich natural resources of Santo Domingo to Secretary of State Fish on behalf of Dominican President Buenaventura Baez. But he and General William Casno were looking to profit from this adventure, having acquired large land holdings whose value would soar if the Dominican Republic became part of the United States. As a military officer, Grant was impressed by the excellent harbor at Samana Bay, which was potentially an excellent coaling station for naval ships. Already, America was eyeing Panama for a possible canal connecting the oceans, and an American presence at Samana Bay could protect the approach to the strategic region. After Spain had withdrawn from Santo Domingo in 1865, the country felt threatened by Haiti, its much larger neighbor with millions of inhabitants. Santo Domingo at that time had a tiny population of 150,000, with an educated elite of mixed Spanish, mulatto, and Indian ancestry. The Baez government and much of the elite favored American annexation of the island, and President Johnson favored annexing both Santo Domingo and Haiti together. Why didn't the United States proceed with the annexation of Santo Domingo? In part because of the diplomatic bungling by President Grant. He was skilled at giving orders as general, but was inept in political horse trading and compromise. He was opposed by Senator Charles Sumner, chairman of the Committee of Foreign Relations. This annexation was unpopular because it was too much of a stretch for the time. Many Americans did not want to annex a territory that had a tropical republic with Spanish-speaking Roman Catholics. American involvement in the island did not end. During the Wilson administration, American troops occupied both the Dominican Republic and Haiti for many years. During this occupation, America built the first extensive road system in Santo Domingo and invested in hundreds of schools and other infrastructure. But we know the sordid history of the relations between Haiti and America. If Santo Domingo had been annexed to the United States, how would that have affected American history? What would be different today? The alternate history is impossible to imagine. Previously, we reflected on the overview of the war in our Civil War through paintings. We also reflected on the key Battle of Gettysburg, the successful Union siege of Vicksburg, the surrender of Appomattox, and how the Civil War was more brutal for horses than their riders, and the role horses and cavalry played throughout history. And we have other reflections on the Civil War, including showing that the Confederacy seceded from the Union and fought the Civil War to preserve slavery, how slaves helped the Union win the war, and why Union soldiers were willing to lay down their lives in battle to preserve the Union. Now we'll discuss the sources we used for this video. Ulysses S. Grant's Civil War Memoirs was a bestseller when it was originally published after 1885. Ron Chernow wrote an excellent biography of Grant in 2017, including his presidency, which Grant does not discuss in depth in his memoir. For a more complete review of our sources, please view our Appomattox reflection. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus, we will host special discussion groups for our patrons. Plus, you can click on the meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts. And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.